I think I wanted to dim the lights, so if I don't know which ones are which. Is that okay for everyone to see? Well, it's fantastic to be back here in Cambridge. Thank you, Professor Necipolu, for the introduction and the invitation, as well as all the adversarial role you played in this research. And it's terrific to see so many familiar faces in the audience. So today I'll be speaking about the German construction of the Ottoman railway network, a network constructed between 1868 and 1919, spanning modern-day Bosnia, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, so a huge area. I will be doing this through the close examination of a selection of buildings and monuments constructed in tandem with the railways, while relating them to the wider context of imperial and colonial history and what this might tell us about the nature of intercultural exchange in the context of an early internationalizing, perhaps even globalizing world order. The international press frequently printed maps depicting the German-Ottoman railway partnership as a simple line running from Hamburg to Baghdad, the so-called Berlin-Baghdad Railway as its pseudonym. The line, extrapolated from a wider network of railways connecting Central and Western Europe, epitomizes the axiomatic caricature of Germany's involvement with the railways in the Middle East, producing, as it were, a link between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, an alternative to the Suez Canal, and a German stronghold in the Middle East. The reality, however, was far more complex. The construction of an Ottoman railway network conceived autonomously through Ottoman ambitions to modernize and tanzimat reforms was constructed in only piecemeal fashion under German management. This map illustrates these sections of the Ottoman railway network constructed, showing both the extensive geographic scope of the project as well as its discontinuity, partly the result of being aborted by the end of World War I. So the idea was that this would actually connect to the European networks in existence, and then between Nusaybin and Mosul, there would be a connection that was unfinished, and actually a connection all the way to the port of Basra. So while the places where these tracks were laid certainly bore witness to a massive German influence, no locale was ever colonized in a formal manner, and thus the events that took place, particularly the construction of buildings, highlight a particular dynamic of ambiguity. As such, the German construction of the Ottoman railway network offers us the opportunity to critically reconsider the tenets of a particular term used time and again in the historiography of architecture generated in cross-cultural contexts: expertise in broader political, economic, and cultural structures distinct from the typical processes we know from the study of empire and colonialism. Whereas on the one side, we see a clear desire on behalf of the Ottomans for German technological and economic expertise, we also bear witness to thousands of construction sites, perhaps hundreds, debating on your definition of what a construction site is, large and small, where German plans were executed by way of the expertise of Ottoman laborers and craftsmen under varying degrees of German supervision, providing an exemplar for what Soraya Farocki has described as an informal system of artisanal input in the wake of the demise of the traditional guild system. My study capitalizes on the very ambiguity of this input system between German and Ottomans, which we could, if we so choose, call semi, quasi, or even para-colonial in nature. I prefer, however, to privilege a formal moniker, transmutation, over a political one. In so doing, I situate the architecture, engineering, and urbanism of the German-Ottoman railway network as a variegated and often dialogic model of cultural engagement in which both German and Ottoman agents, from the Sultan to the engineer to the simple laborer, had agency in the production of buildings and places. I identify this process as transmutation, a process which takes ambiguity as a postulate and sheds light on the ways in which ambiguity also functioned as a condition in the daily lives of those involved in the production of physical objects related to the railway. So the material I'm presenting today, as is known to many here, is based on my dissertation. Since its completion, I've refined it into a shorter manuscript. It was way too long, which comprises 8 chapters. Chapter 1 sets the German construction of the Ottoman railway network in political and historical context. Chapter 2 analyzes a half-century of geographic knowledge that developed in tandem with the railways. Chapter 3 analyzes topography as a form of knowledge unique to the construction of infrastructure in general and rail in particular. And as Professor Necipolu mentioned, this chapter includes a series of previously unpublished maps and urban studies by the German engineer Wilhelm von Pressel and is currently in press as an article. Chapter 4 looks at several key moments of archaeological activity, so the sites of Gordium, Tel Halaf, Mashhata, Samal, and Samarra, where the construction of rail played an allied role. Chapter 5 considers the construction processes that lay behind the planning of the railways and examines ways in which the authorship, power, and craft were circumscribed by administrative and legal frameworks. Chapters 6 and 7, dealing with stations and monuments respectively, outline myriad architectural entities constructed. And Chapter 8, focusing on urbanism, considers a series of sui generis case studies of new urban arrangements made as a result of the railway. So I will share with you today a selection of material from chapters 5, 6, and 7, material that illustrates the process of transmutation with particular force. And after touching upon some key aspects of construction, we will confront a scheme in which architecture is slotted into one of 3 categories: the serial structure, the showpiece, and the monument. A picture of everyday life on the Ottoman railway network's construction site is a good place to begin. Knowledge of these sites comes to us from a variety of sources, including governmental and consular archives, construction firm and subcontractor records, first-hand accounts such as diaries and travel writings, and photographs. Notwithstanding the German-Ottoman substrate of the railway's framework, the population of these work sites was characterized by its polycultural composition, an admixture of national and ethnic groups, each often with their own role. For sake of emphasis, I wish to enumerate here all such groups I encountered in my research. So I'm about to make a list, please pardon me. Albanian, American, Anatolian, Arab, Armenian, Australian, Austrian, Bavarian, Bedouin, British, Catholic, Circassian, Cretan, Cypriot, Druze, Egyptian, French, German, Germanic, Greek, Hungarian, Italian, Jewish, Kiwi, Kurdish, Lebanese, Macedonian, Maltese, Muslim, non-Christian, non-Muslim, non-Ottoman, Ottoman, Protestant, Prussian, Romanian, Russian, Sudanese, Swabian, Swiss, Syriac, Turkish, and Yazidi. It might be tempting to extrapolate a de facto cosmopolitanism from such a diverse aggregation of peoples. This would, however, be a romantic mischaracterization, which fails to recognize the trenchant hierarchies, power imbalances, and intercultural strife deriving from differences in hourly pay, a tacit distinction between craft and labor, expert and non-expert, and the simple fact that many of the railway workers were there involuntarily, either for corvée or as prisoners of war, and how all of these things changed the nature of construction. Well, the enumeration of the railway network's polycultural character provides a more complete picture of who built the railways. An account of how they were built is the next step in explicating the process of transmutation. So, given the massive amounts of time, money, and human capital involved, the contours of transmutation, like the labor forces, varied from worksite to worksite. Nevertheless, there are some remarkable consistencies in both the process and the output, and these reflect the uniform German way of building railway beds, tracks, culverts, tunnels, bridges, stations, workshops, and other facilities. This was the result of the fact that the drawings for all but a few of the stations, namely those conceived as showpieces, were conceived as typological sets to be transferred across locations. So, for example, in 3 of the 4 discrete railway subsections in the greater network in question, the Anatolian railways, the Baghdad Railway, and the Hejaz Railway and its Palestinian tributaries, stations and their ancillary structures were conceived along a ranking system of first, second, third, and fourth class stations. First being the most important and hence the most bespoke, and fourth being the smallest and most common. The class of a station was more or less related to the perceived importance of a given locale. This was calculated by the locale's population, but also on occasion, as in the fascinating case of Aleppo, through the input of the port, which expressed its interest in emphasizing one place over another for its historical and or cultural significance, so not just its actual population count. The aesthetic legibility of the network is rooted in this system of prefabricated typologies, but also in part from the bureaucracy of the German construction process, even for the ostensibly autonomous Ottoman construction of the Hejaz Railway. The railway network's various discrete concessionary agreements spelled out construction methods, resources, protocol, and policies in painstaking detail. As well, the regular carrying over of personnel contributed to this consistency. So the main engineers involved, which included von Pressel and others by the names of Otto Kapp von Gulstein, Ernst Mackensen, and Heinrich August Meisner, who was made a pasha, above all, freely transferred from one line to another. A third factor, paradoxically contributing to the network's cogent aesthetic program, was the capacity for inflection from the transmutation process itself. Despite the rigid bureaucratic and personnel superstructure, there was abundant room for aesthetic timbre by all of the agents involved, and this is the sole fact that has made an extensive research project devoid of any progressive figures or spectacular works of architecture, nevertheless so exciting as an architectural historian. Because the construction of buildings within the Ottoman railway network was the product of a systematized process, I found that it is important to grapple with the minutiae of the bureaucracy of construction. Agreements between the railway companies and the Ministry of the Interior or the Ministry of Commerce and Public Works covered the overall range of objectives for each line. Each bulky folio series contains documents consisting of approximately 50 articles appended with an ad hoc set of statutes and a crucial cahier des charges, or work specifications. As a whole, the documents are primarily concerned with the specifics of financial arrangements, spanning everything from kilometric guarantees and details of 99-year concessions to tariffs for dogs and chickens traveling the railway. But only a few articles are relevant to the domain of construction. Article 8, for example, eliminated all tax burdens for the import of materials and created a considerable incentive to mix the materials and machinery used to construct and create the railway and its structures into a delicate international balance of cost and quality. Such mixing often meant that Ottoman materials and products, when sufficient for the best practices of German engineering and architecture, would be employed for their cost effectiveness. When they were not sufficient, there was to be no hesitation to have them brought in from abroad. Article 10 relates to the acquisition of wood and gave the German managers a carte blanche to cut down trees, a practice which had by then become heavily regulated and promoted the liberal employment of wood as a building material for anything apart from the ashlar shell of the station. Moreover, it cultivated a diversity among the types of wood employed, given the particular species found across this wide region, which includes Turkish oak, pine, Lebanon cedar, Aleppo fir, pistachio, juniper, and laurel, to name just a few. Point 1 of the Cahier des Charges outlines a number of important materials and procedural specifications relating to the, quote, disposition of station buildings, their representation and approval, and their relation to their immediate environment. This may be the only signal of an outwardly aesthetic concern across the administrative literature. Key excerpts from Article 11 bear quoting at length, and I quote, The concessionaire will construct works from as good quality materials as are to be found in the country and must comply with best practices in order to obtain as perfectly solid a construction as can be constructed from the given material. Steel bridges will be calculated according to the latest circular from the Ministry of Public Works from France or Prussia. The track crosses are to be the type adopted by the railways of the Prussian state. Regarding the provisions and construction of buildings, stations, and booths, it is agreed that the rules of strict necessity be maintained, keeping in mind the convenience and ordinary customs of the country. Finally, stations will be built of stone or brick. They may have flat roofs and floors of stone, brick, or concrete, end quote. These clauses set up an important array of regulations as much as they did opportunities for the construction process. On the one hand, the outline of permissible materials for bridges and the process for testing them is rather rigid. On the other, the guidelines for the construction of railway stations paint only the vaguest hint of an aesthetic program. That flat roofs are permissible is perhaps the single most recognizable acknowledgement of stylistic concerns on the eve, if you will, of modernism. Clearly, overall, sturdiness, durability, and strength of the structures was of the greatest import. The, quote, rules of strict necessity and the, quote, ordinary customs of the country are the most culturally significant provisions, which implicate a handful of cultural norms that the Ottoman government intended to reinforce and highlight. While these most clearly include the need to divide men and women within the station building, the meanings in regard to other spatial patterns were truly open to interpretation or ambiguous. Let us turn to Article 12, which states that the drawn plans of stations and structures will be prepared at a universal scale of 1 to 200. The requirement of a 1 to 200 drawing scale for a structure with a spatial envelope that was smaller than most industrial structures is noteworthy. After all, when disparately sized structures, say a small sentry booth and an entire massive workshop, are rendered at the same scale, the relative detail and articulation of the smaller structure in relationship to the larger one tends to make it flatter and more scaleless and diminishes its potential for ornamental embellishment. Conversely, since buildings, while being built, are rarely constructed from drawings alone, the potential for ad hoc ornamentation and detailing increases in inverse proportion to the scale of the original drawings. Indeed, the drawings of several of the railway structures lack the detail they actually exhibit in situ, making clear the dynamic role played by the artisans. And I want to show you here a few examples of this process of transmutation. You see here this slightly pointed window frame in Bilejic. Here you can see a finial which is added to the roofline of a historic photo of Konya Station. A sign noting that a women's waiting room at another station in Palatla, which I could not find in the drawings. And then even here back in Konya, a railway gauge functioning as a support for a fence outside the station, which is also not in the drawings. While the scale of the drawings for the railway network's Hochbau, this is the German administrative term for construction above the Earth's surface, so not architecture, but Hochbau, meaning anything above ground level, was defined in the railway company's agreement with the Ministry of the Interior. The process for its review and approval was typically established between the railway company and the contracting construction firm, which was in all cases but the Hejaz Railway, a German company, and in the case of the Hejaz Railway, under the directorship of a German Meisner. This is perhaps the most significant document outlining the bureaucracy of the transmutation process. The agreement reads as follows, and I quote, "The preparation of the final plans of the building is to be done by the contractor. Each completed plan is to be first presented to the railway company, who will examine it and suggest amendments or supplements that will be in turn returned and presented for authorization from the Turkish government by the railway company. The final plans approved are thereafter to form the basis for their construction and may not be changed without the express written permission of the railway company, except on insignificant deviations caused by local conditions, end quote. The deviations caused by local conditions include deviations of species of wood and types of stone, brick, and mortar. The documents do not define other forms of deviation, such as the skills of one labor group in comparison to another, climactic or cultural concerns, and they most certainly do not articulate deviation as a term that could encompass cultural variegation, or as a consequence, different manipulations of architectural elements for cultural signification. Architectural signification was not really a priority, but this does not mean that meaningful deviations did not happen. And this clause reveals a twofold window of opportunity for every individual building the railways. First, changes to architectural drawings that were sought after the Turkish government's approval did not need to be reapproved by the government, but only by the railway company, which was thus placed in the role of arbiter and compromise broker, determining which architectural changes deemed necessary on-site were deviant from the original plan and which were not. Architectural changes deemed too deviant could be made possible, in all likelihood, by middle ground solutions. Say the shape of a window frame mediated by the railway company. And moreover, changes deemed insignificantly deviant did not even require the permission of the railway company, but could simply be executed and approved by the construction company, which would typically mean the head engineer on a given work site, one whose expertise was in Bahnbau, so railway construction, and not Hochbau. This points in particular to the authorial agency the stonemasons and woodworkers enjoyed in determining their own best practices, and the subtle, circumscribed aesthetic agendas from one site to the other. German and Ottoman records alike rarely indicate the names of the unskilled and semi-skilled workers, and the accounts of the engineers indicate that they were mostly day laborers from the immediate vicinity who were paid on a day-to-day basis and tabulated in the payment records by their numbers and not by their names. As such, we know little to nothing about the workers themselves, but deductive reasoning does tell us that the builders of buildings with dissimilarities that do not appear in the plans that precede them mean that these workers are, in fact, authors of variations and authors of this architecture. My point in saying this is to assert and prove synthetic forms of subaltern authorship within a hegemonic building program that was German in its essentialized form. The dissimilarities between stations constructed in series are thus immensely significant in understanding the transmutation process. As numerous histories of ethnic crafts and guilds indicate, an ethnic subgroup also codified relative strengths in one building craft over another, and thus the changes themselves likely point to the identities of their authors and so many of the ethnic groups that I listed earlier. We also benefit from being reminded that these transmutations were not merely tactical operations for the Ottoman builders, so too were they occasionally for Germans, or at least that is what is indicated by the mysterious wooden decal which appears on the top of the ticket window frame at the small station of Iron-Schödebend. And you can see that here. This is what I'm referring to. Although the details are hidden beneath several layers of paint, the silhouette clearly outlines a Bundesadler, the heraldic symbol of the German Empire. This addition appears neither in the drawings nor in the written record, but its presence in situ is without a doubt a significant statement, one that may indicate how the German engineer made adaptations to the generic plans for the stations, asserting their German tutelage explicitly through additive graphic symbols as opposed to implicitly through architectural form. The architect about whom we know the most is the Frankfurt-trained architect Helmuth Kuno, who, in addition to designing the showpiece station at the Anatolian Railway's Asian terminus, Hyder Pasha Station, and more on this in a minute, he designed the first, second, and third class stations for a stretch of the Baghdad Railway extending from Konya to Aleppo, otherwise known as the Cilician section. Kuno's designs for this group of buildings, executed in 1910, presents a radical formal departure from those of the Anatolian railways, which you might remember from the earlier drawings I showed. which in Eskişehir and Ankara, which followed the idiom of the widely used German Heimatstil. Orientalizing details which are evident across the family may be found most visibly in apertures, including ticket windows, the detailing of the eaves, and the fountains installed at entryways. The sole clue in the archival record as to a possible reason for the design changes comes from a memo the architect transmitted to the section's engineer, in which Cuno makes a passing mention of the architectural changes, noting, quote, "As a result of the negotiations where Mr. Riese was present, a whole ream of alterations to the building designs and the contract have been made," end quote. This suggests that the presence of Otto Riese, a prolific engineer of German ports and railway networks in its colonial holdings in Africa, most notably in Dar es Salaam, was key in the changes that were made, and that it was he who advocated for the Islamicizing elements in the course of a meeting that records indicate lasted but only 20 minutes. Transmutations, in other words, can occur both swiftly and slowly. Few have written about these stations, and those who have attributed the modifications to the fact that Cuno would have been influenced by the evolution of the so-called Ottoman First National style. Two examples you see here on the right. Cuno's designs bear some of the hallmarks of the First National style in their use of the pointed arch, the wide eave, its expansion of traditional building proportions, and the use of decorative elements to codify an Ottoman context. Some pre-existing European characteristics, such as the colonnade, are embellished, while others, such as the barge board or the roof trim, characteristic of the Heimatstil, are altogether eliminated. This challenges the conventional characterization that the First National style developed organically from Ottoman ambition alone, and indicates how the very necessity of the style may have derived not from revolutionary and autonomous Ottoman aims, but also, at least in part, in accordance with the activities of the German architects and engineers already engaged in the empire's modernization. There is another key event fueling this transformation that has also gone ignored. In August of 1908, approximately 700 railway workers mounted a list of concerns in the form of a public grievance to their employer, the Deutsche Bank-run Baghdad Railway Company. The statement stressed that their grievance was not a movement tied to the concurrent one of the Young Turks, but rather an assertion of the simple right to protest a work environment that had, by their accounts, become extremely exploitative under German administration. In a statement issued by a legal representative, the workers, primarily lower-level Muslim Turkish laborers, invoked the Quran to underscore their inherent openness to foreigners, but also to stipulate their right to take issue with particular administrators if they deem them abusive or otherwise unfit. And I quote, "The Quran and Muslim laws require us to consider all men, without distinction of race, nationality, and religion, as our brothers, and to treat them as God teaches. We do not say we do not want any foreign collaborators, but we reserve to say at any time that we do not want this or that person because he simply does not belong," end quote. Belonging is as subjective as it sounds, and hints again to the everyday reality of ambiguity. After decades of relatively peaceable international collaboration, the workers' dissatisfaction caught the Baghdad Railway administrators off guard. And interpreting the problem as fiscal rather than cultural, they sought Deutsche Bank's help in finding a solution. Deutsche Bank, whose task had never been one of multiculturalist diplomacy, did raise wages, but did not offer suggestions about the cultural issues, leaving that up to the railway administrators, who as a group consisting of engineers and architects were left with the unusual task of articulating a new paradigm of cultural equanimity on and through the railway's gestation, and symbolized through architectural designs such as that we have just seen in Silesia. So this perceived need for geopolitical diplomacy through architecture may also be seen as the result of the completion of the symbolic new railway terminus on the Asian side of the Bosphorus, Haydarpasa Station, which if you've been to Istanbul, you can't miss, which was days away from the completion when the strike erupted. And these are actually two different iterations of the design of the building by Kuno, which I found in the archive. And you can see here that the only difference is actually the treatment of the towers here. The building's materials, indexing the railway's course, were derived near exclusively from sites and factories dotting the railways. The foundation, for example, employs granite blocks quarried from the railway enclave of Herica, which happened also to be the home of the Imperial Rug Workshop. The head mason coordinating the stonework we know by the name of Lazarus, indicating his status as a Jewish master. Save the rounded towers on the northern and southern edges, which taper to a cupola and perhaps make a vague allusion to a minaret, the designs articulate a clear Teutonic agenda, with strong echoes from concurrent movements in Frankfurt and Leipzig. The southern portion of the station contains all of its most important spaces along a single corridor, mimicking the typical planar organization of larger European stations of the day. First and second class and third class waiting rooms, a haremlik, sanitary facilities, and the lokanta or restaurant, all seen here. The main reception hall exhibits the building's most extensive ornamental program. Its pastel color scheme and its floridness is largely at odds with the hulking disposition presented by the building's exterior. The geometric stained glass is designed by Otto Linnemann, the Frankfurt art professor and glass specialist, while the tiles of the lokanta alternately have Ottoman origins in the designs of the tile master Mehmed Emin Usta. This push and pull of German modes with Ottoman ones indicates Kuno's early and ultimately insufficient attempts to compromise and transmute stylistic elements. It is no coincidence that when the workers struck in 1908 that they chose the so-called German fountain as their place of protest. The German fountain is the most potent symbol of the German-Ottoman partnership and one whose provenance bears the transmutation process clearly. While relatively demure in size, you can see it here, the fountain derives its prominence from its strategic location at the northern end of the hippodrome among all the sites marking the gravitational center of Constantinople. It is also noteworthy that the fountain stands approximately on the site of the famed Vak-Vak tree, where a number of officials in the court of Mehmed IV were decapitated during the Janissary Rebellion of 1656. Upon returning to Berlin from his Orientreise, or Orient trip of 1898, Wilhelm summoned the trusted state architect Max Spitta, apparently made a quick sketch of a fountain to be given as a memento to the Sultan, and asked Spitta to develop and execute it. Apparently, Wilhelm had been intrigued by the fountain's double function in Islamic society as both a benevolent civic provision and a facilitator of the customs of worship. At some point thereafter, the emperor and Spitta enlisted the service of the former Ottoman ambassador to Berlin and the minister of foreign affairs, Ahmed Tevfik Pasha, who, equipped with perfect German, relayed Spitta's plans for the fountain to the Sultan through verbal descriptions of its form. The project was unique for Spitta, who, apart from a management role in the construction of the famed and widely derided Siegesallee, which you see here at the top, had spent his entire career as the architect of sacral buildings, designing a wide range of prominent historicist churches in Berlin, as well as the well-known Erlöserkirche in Bad Homburg. Spitta's design went through several iterations before Wilhelm found them satisfactory. The first consists of a covered octagonal pavilion constructed of medium-sized ashlar with stout Byzantine-style columns of black marble and thickly framed rounded arches. An upper band contains triangular pediments punctured by 3 similarly proportioned miniature projecting portals, a large one in the center and 2 smaller ones on either side. Beneath, a heraldic shield depicts the same Bundesadler we have encountered earlier on 2 sections, and the Tura, or the Sultan's imperial emblem, on a third. Above the cornice line is rendered in relief. Above, the cornice line is rendered in relief, and at each corner supports an entablature that also depicts the Bundesadler. The roof rises to a circular top that supports an oversized rendition of the German imperial crown. A second sectional drawing illustrates the ornamental scheme of the fountain's interior, which shows a brown, blue, yellow scheme of decorative dots that appear to indicate a mosaic. I'm zooming in here because upon closer inspection of the elevation, one notices a large X, you see here, in pencil, drawn across the center of the fountain's image. The intersection of the X appears virtually on top of the Bundesadler. The X is most certainly the mark of Kaiser Wilhelm himself, indicating, as it would, a rejection of Spitta's scheme, and perhaps, just perhaps, the figurative Bundesadler in particular. Is this an indication of Kaiser Wilhelm's cognizance of the supposed prohibition of figural motifs in Islamic art? Wilhelm was, after all, an amateur student of the Orient and Islam. Regardless, the Bundesadler, which now emerges as the locus of visible versus invisible extraterritorial ambition, would not appear in subsequent iterations. A second design, rendered only in light pencil, alters the previous design by subdividing the large arches into two smaller ones. The upper pediment band is eliminated in favor of a simpler row of miniature arches, 7 on each face. The roof is rounded and somewhat squatter and culminates with a small crown-like cap resting on a circle of columns. A third design modifies this scheme slightly, placing a rosette between the paired columns and the apex of the larger column of each face. It also articulates the fountain program explicitly with an elevation and a plan. A large fountain rests at the center of the interior platform, which is accessed from the ground level by 11 stairs. On the exterior, fountains are embedded on the sides of each face. The fountains here on the side, save for the face of the stairs, obviously creating a circumference with 7 fountains in total. A fourth design removes the upper band altogether, extending the length of the columns significantly and changing their proportioning through the use of wide rounded arches with pronounced voussoirs and decoratively carved Byzantine-style capitals. A round motif marks the apex of each arch and rests under a slender cornice line supporting a semi-spherical dome with external banding. The roof culminates at a small base with a motif that appears to be some sort of hybrid of a fleur-de-lis and a finial, similar to the ones we saw in the Anatolian railways. The fifth design, relatively similar to the fourth, is the realized project. An elevation indicates the presence of a new, lower decorative band on the perimeter, directly above the fountains on each face. The band contains a circular emblem that alternates between the Tura and a crowned W, Wilhelm's imperial monogram. It is noteworthy that with the stairs leaving one less face for the octagonal structure, it is the imperial Tura that has 4 occurrences in contrast to the Kaiser's 3. The structure in the interior is no longer a prototypical fountain, but rather a large elevated mound, almost like a stupa, that allows water to slowly trickle downward from its top. The roof is rendered in copper plates, confirmed by the roof's appearance in the photograph of the model, and is set in scale by the presence of a figurine wearing a fez, perhaps the Sultan himself. So you see him here. Another section rounds out the series. The lush marble and porphyry columns of the realized project belie their flat feel in the drawings. The fountain was constructed as a prefabricated kit of parts under the direction of Spitta in Berlin and shipped to Istanbul via Hamburg, arriving sometime in late 1900. Up close, the fountain bears out a highly codified program of symbols and inscriptions. These include 2 epistolary works, one in German and one in Ottoman. Tevfik Pasha's correspondence indicates his awareness of the former, but not the latter. The Ottoman text is in the form of an 8-couplet poem by Ahmet Muhtar Bey with epigraphy by Hatat Izzet Effendi, reproduced by the Berlin mosaic artist August Oetken, appearing as a band of undulating text over 8 archways within the interior of the dome in a lively array of green, blue, and red upon a golden background. The text, presumably authored with Abdul Hamid's blessing, is a typical hagiographic epigram, identifying Wilhelm as a, quote, well-informed, able soldier, a compassionate visitor to the Holy Land, and a ruler who is, quote, honored with the respect of Islam, end quote. The word used for the fountain, says Sabil, actually refers to a mythical fountain in paradise providing sweet water. The exterior plaque in German notes the banal facts of the dedication, so the dates and stuff like that. While the German archives reveal certain tensions in the morphology of Spitta's design, Ottoman records speak to the tensions around the issue of the fountain's siting. In the summer of 1899, the General Protocols Office reported that the Sultan, upon hearing of the Kaiser's intention to give the fountain as a gift, noted that the Sultan thought that the remote suburb of Neshantasha would be an ideal location. With a great deal of polite flourishes, an official by the name of Tassin reported Wilhelm's apparent objection to siting the fountain in the suburb, preferring instead to situate it in a place where the Kaiser's obedience to the Porte would be seen by more people. And so it was resolved to locate the fountain in its ultimate, extremely prominent location. After being inaugurated in January of 1901, the fountain provided a continual stream of headaches for its beneficiaries. Within a matter of weeks, vandals had stripped the fountain of all its faucets and a number of its most precious mosaic stones. To make matters worse, the vandalism forced a protracted debate between the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Public Works, and the Grand Vizier himself as to who precisely was in charge of the fountain's well-being. The debate essentially hinged on whether the fountain was considered, first and foremost, a diplomatic symbol or a waterwork. The onus of the fountain's upkeep ultimately fell upon the Ministry of the Interior, indicating that the delegation of diplomatic symbol trumped that of a fountain. The Ministry of the Interior replaced the faucets and the missing stones with ones custom made by the same artisan who happened to also then be simultaneously reconstructing a number of missing or damaged stones and mosaics at the Topkapi Palace. This indicates that the authorities were loath to call upon Spitta himself for the replacement parts, perhaps for fear of embarrassment over their custodial neglect. When the replacement faucets were again stolen 3 weeks later, it became clear that the cause of their theft lay not in any perceived value of German faucets per se, but in a general public disregard for the fountain's status as a site for ablutions. The Ministry of the Interior was both baffled and irritated by the recurring faucet disappearances, and after replacing them a second time and building a wrought iron fence around the structure to the tune of 140,000 piasters, delegated the fountain's security to the Constantinople police sergeant Arif, who appointed full-time guards, one of whom we know by the name of Nuri, to protect the fountain. To add insult to injury, the Grand Vizier found the fences ugly and had them reconstructed for a higher cost than the previous set. This was the gift that kept on giving. It is instructive to consider the development of the project with its 5 iterations, inscriptions, and ornamental program, and the complex issues of siting and security through the lens of Spitta's career, which in high historicist fashion melded elements of Gothic, Romanesque, and Byzantine architecture in various measures and with numerous twists. For here it becomes clear that the fountain's designer wrestled with a number of the ideological issues at the fulcrum of style and nationalism. The development of the fountain's design articulates a clear trajectory from a German nationalist bravura to an architectural treatise on equanimity, as evidenced by the alternating medallions and so many other features. This, despite Wilhelm's strong arming of the fountain's placement in the historic core as opposed to a suburb. This proposal of equanimity is further supported by the Byzantine motifs that Spitta brought to the fore, with the potential on the one hand to symbolize the Byzantine channel of influence on Ottoman architecture and that empire's Christian heritage on the other, which at the time of Justinian extended to the borders of German-speaking Europe. So I'm postulating that the Byzantine Empire is some kind of link, which Spitta is trying to use. A cartoon published in Kalem in 1908 indicates that at least some in the Ottoman community read quasi-colonial symbolism into the fountain. In the image, a tree, presumably in dialogue with the mythical Vakvak tree, is depicted steadily growing and encircling the fountain, ultimately decapitating its top section from its bottom and allegorizing it as a potential victim of another rebellion, as it was in 1656. While the German fountain publicly celebrated the achievements of the railway and its attendant modernity, there were a spate of monuments hidden far from the view of the urban public that memorialize other aspects of the railway's construction, manifested tactically as opposed to geostrategically. So for example, in the far northeast of Mersin province, about halfway between the villages of Gulek and Chamalan, and a few miles away from the workers' colony of Belamedik, stands a monument memorializing the lives of 41 German nationals who perished during the construction of the Baghdad Railway. And I actually knew many of these names from my archival work, but what was interesting was that I also knew at this same workers' camp there was 2 female nurses who died from disease, and their names were not listed on this monument. So it was a monument for men, and just to point out that there's also gender issues related to this. The monument appears to be connected to 3 other memorials in the area. Chamalan had been an important center for truck transportation as it stood at the center of the unfinished rail route. A photograph from circa 1916 depicts an improvisational memorial to fallen German truck drivers. 3 cannons surround an outcropping of rock with the names of those lost inscribed on a tablet set within it. Atop the tablet is a winged wheel, similar to one I found at a railway monument in Haifa. Chamalan was also home to a German cemetery, this one for Germans engaged in military service. The cemetery is surrounded by a low stone wall, which appears to be of the same stone produced for the railway's tunnels, bridges, and culverts. In Belamedik, there was also a German cemetery, which comprised a low rounded wall surrounding a central stone, which commemorated 3 ranking military officers. Rectangular stones set into the earth can also be seen in the back, possibly indicating the burial places of lower ranking soldiers. So I'd like now to look at these works in panorama. And I would like to pose the question as to whether their heterogeneous character lends itself to anything resembling a clear operation, let alone my naive proposal of transmutation. Let me now return historiographically to that concept to explore this question. My inspiration to use this term is inspired by Marshall Hodgson's exegesis on world civilization circa the so-called generation of 1789. That's his term. Derived from the 3rd volume of his seminal Venture of Islam series, which define the ways in which specific economic, social, and intellectual transformations in the Occident fractured the Afro-Eurasian ecumenical world and facilitated a definitive European hegemony in the 19th and a, quote, paramountcy in the 20th centuries. His focus is one of process as opposed to product, mechanics as opposed to a meta-narrative of progress. The transmutation as such was less the alienation of life, as it is known to us through Benjamin, Habermas, and others, than it was one of what Hodgson describes as a process of technicalism, a subtler form of post-Enlightenment rational culture fueled by the desire for efficiency and expedience, all the while resistant to the alienation between subject and object. To be sure, within the Islamic world, the transmutation and its technicalist grasp presented particular lines of conflict and anxiety. While the Islamic florescence of the Middle Ages had furnished a place for institutions of individual calculation, these are Hodgson's terms, it had not emphasized specialization in equal measure, and thus fomented a system where innovation tended to occur non-autonomously and through longer periods of gestation and iteration. The German construction of the Ottoman railways epitomized the great cultural transmutation in its physical transformation of the Ottoman environment, and German expertise epitomized the new imperatives of technicalism that legitimized it. And yet, both sides remained sovereign and cooperative. These transmutations, by the very ambiguous nature of their context, resist broad aesthetic categorization and may appear as pedestrian or derivative forms. For this, there are some good explanations. First, as the product of a strategic geopolitical partnership, aesthetic sensitivity and the creation of meaning through form were imperatives that reliably followed exceptionally contingent political conditions on a secondary or even tertiary level. there's evidence to suggest that even when form constituted a geopolitical priority, as it did with the German fountain, that it was conceived in the spirit of improvisation under stopgap conditions without a well-developed ideology or critical aesthetic repertoire, in part because many of its actors were not trained as visual thinkers with a visual regime in mind. So in that part, I'm referring primarily to the engineers. This, I argue, is a new paradigm that takes its place outside of the dialectical and well-worn East-West colonized-colonizer couplings and attempts to reckon the importance of the dyad and the dialectical with the realities of unconventional relationships that characterized an early globalizing world order as it existed beyond the official colonial or imperial stage, but rather in its precarious interstices. We could possibly look to places like Thailand, Persia, or Ethiopia in the future for comparison. By way of the example of the German construction of the Ottoman railway network, I argue that the early internationalization of architecture was a phenomenon of simultaneously progressive and conservative aims. This duality stems from what I illustrate as the relentless instrumentalization of the concept of technological expertise in design practice, a process that synthesized non-formal networks of domination in broader geopolitical contexts on the one hand, and an emancipatory apparatus for subaltern groups on the other. This finding furnishes a model of cultural production whose unique characteristic derives from its ambiguous political situation, making for what I describe as the central morphological leitmotif of transmutation. What this outlines is the ways in which ambiguity emerged as an operation instead of a condition, and became a way of negotiating innovation in knowledge and form amid the excitement and duress of global modernity. While the 19th century has commonly been characterized as a period of multiplicity, fluidity, and unbridled innovation, I hope to have argued today for the actual utility of the ambiguity that results, and measured against the extent to which its agents, from state leaders to railway laborers, were actively aware of its potential and proponents of its transmutation. Thank you so much.